No, Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 is not terrible, and no, this video isn't clickbait either. Everyone on the internet seems to hate this game, even those who haven't even started to play it, and the consensus is that it's one of the worst games of all time. I thought the same way, but then I decided to play it myself and see if it's as bad as it's made out to be, and it really isn't. It misses the mark in so many areas, and it's definitely not a good game, but we need to stop with this worst game of all time BS. Is it sloppy? Yeah. Is the story cringy as hell? You bet, but there's some good in it, and it expanded on the adventure titles that came before it in countless ways. But before we get into things, if you agree the game's hated on too much, drop me a like, and if you disagree, drop a comment and explain why, but be sure to listen to all I have to say before jumping to any bold conclusions. I'm gonna start with the gameplay and level designs, then discuss the hub world, the audio and visuals, and finish with the plot. If you want to see my thoughts on anything in particular, it's timestamps, so skip to where you'd like. The gameplay in Sonic the Hedgehog is an evolution of the foundation that Adventure laid and Adventure 2 expanded upon. Gameplay is primarily split between 3 story modes: Sonic, Shadow, and Silver, and I think the multiple playstyles are way more balanced than previous titles. Adventure gave you a whopping 6 story modes, 2 or 3 of which are not at all worth your time and put a lackluster and bland gameplay style in the spotlight for way too long. Sure, it made the Sonic story mode way more consistent and enjoyable, but the variety it offered didn't change the pace of the experience at all. Once you finished all the super fun Sonic levels, you'd play all of Tails' levels, all of Knuckles' levels, and so on. None of these modes had diversity within, it just gives you more options on what experience you'd like to have. Adventure 2 does it better as it mixes them all together, but it forces you to play quite a bit of the gameplay styles you don't like. That's the biggest thing I see the adventure games take a beating for, these alternate gameplay styles not being fun and therefore making only 1/3 or 1/6 of the game actually good. But now that these gameplay styles are practically non-existent in recent Sonic games, people want them back? I don't get it. I guess the adventure games have a bit too much of them and the absolute absence of them in current games are too extreme, but you know what game has the perfect balance of them? Sonic 06. Each story mode is primarily played through as that character, but a level here and a section there will require the use of another character, which is exactly how it should be. They break up the main gameplay enough to give the game a change of pace, but don't overstay their welcome and feel like monotonous chores. If Sonic's friends are once again going to be made playable, this is how it should be done. I'm not saying that the gameplay styles themselves are all that great in this game, I'm simply saying that, in concept, this way works the best. So let's move on to the gameplay itself. Sonic plays just like he does in the adventure games, complete with the spin dash, homing attack, bounce, and light dash. New is the ability to do the sweeping kick to take out close range enemies and crates, which I like. Also new is the lack of being able to jump on enemies to kill them. If it's not a homing attack, you'll take damage, but I honestly never relied on that anyways. It's just so much easier to homing attack, and this never got in the way for me. Sonic, along with every other character, controls way more tightly than ever before. You have extreme precision with every movement, which can be good and bad. This makes it tough to even run in a straight line, but it makes maneuvering platforming sections much easier, so it's a decent trade-off. Yes, the gameplay is very buggy and glitchy, I know, but to be honest, these didn't affect my playthrough a whole lot. Was it a little frustrating here and there? Of course. Did it cost me a handful of lives? Yes, but none of them were anything close to game breaking. Immersion breaking for sure, but they aren't as bad or apparent as they're made out to be. The game was rushed and the gameplay isn't super polished, but it still can be fun in my opinion. Sonic's standard gameplay is great, and the level designs of his levels are some of the best in the series. The first adventure game had more open levels, usually with 1 or 2 correct ways to progress. Adventure 2 had completely linear levels with a couple branching paths here and there, and this game has tons of different routes to take. The levels aren't super open, but there's shortcuts everywhere and tons of different ways to get to the goal. And there's these silver medals hidden around each level too, which further encourage you to take all the different routes and keep your eyes peeled for new ways to go. Most are in plain sight on certain routes and require a quick reaction from the player, but others are hidden around the world and reward you for looking around every corner. While levels are more open-ended, not once did I get lost. I played through each Sonic stage multiple times and had no problem getting to the end, despite being notoriously bad at finding where to go in games. There's a big focus on speed, and despite Sonic being slower than before, it always feels like you're moving quickly. You are slowed down by a few enemies occasionally, but most of the time you can just run right past them, and when you are required to take them out, it doesn't take long at all, and is honestly quite satisfying. The homing attack is crisp, and knocking out enemies with it feels as good as ever. Stages do have a lot more automated sections than the adventure games though, which isn't a good thing, and a lot of them are pretty broken and lead to unnecessary deaths, but they do make the levels much more of a spectacle. And it really helps that the environments of each area are so interesting. There's a lot to look at, and for an early title on the 360 and PS3, they look really good. I've played through both adventure games this past year, and even replayed some of the Sonic stages for the sake of comparing them to this game, and I have to say, these levels feel very similar. The layouts are totally different, that's not what I'm saying. I mean, it's really an evolution of what those games establish in terms of level structure, and it's awesome. The immersion in levels is broken way more often though, and it's not just the glitches, it's the loading during levels. This isn't just for the Sonic levels, this is present in all types of gameplay and totally blows. The first adventure game did this a couple times, but it lasted like a second and didn't mess with the flow of things much. Here it happens multiple times in almost every level and they last like 30 seconds, which is ridiculous. It's a very unoptimized game, with stupid long load times and tons of slowdown. They were trying to do too much. They saw this next gen hardware and were like, It's a very ambitious game to say the least, and it would definitely benefit from a re-release. Even if they only fixed the load times, it would make the experience miles better. As it is though, the Sonic levels are a lot of fun, but there's 2 additional ways you play as Sonic. First is while he's holding a leash. The only ability you lose is the spin dash, and I never use that anyway, so it's the same to me. You also play as Sonic in these mock speed sections, which yes, suck. You can hardly control him, and once you bump something, you dead. But there's only a few of them in the entire game. It stinks that they drain lives so fast and are at the end of already long levels, but these sections aren't as frequent as you think. It only takes like a minute to beat. They feel way more like they belong in the game though. The adventure games tried sections like this, most notably the truck and city escape, but it required hardly anything from the player and happened so rarely that it felt out of place. It makes sense for Sonic to zoom away from something at top speeds, but there was hardly any gameplay to it. 06 was the first true attempt at making something like this an actual gameplay style, and I really think this is what evolved into the boost Sonic gameplay of future games. They wanted to make the games feel more high speed, so they added the boost to let the player do that whenever they wanted, and the additions like the quick step arose because of the issues this game highlighted in these intense speed sections. I hate these sections, but they did serve as a learning experience for Sonic teams, so at least there's one positive aspect to them. Sonic's story also features Tails and Knuckles as playable characters, and these aren't good. Tails can fly for a short time and attack with bombs, and Knuckles can punch, glide, and climb, which is pretty broken. These characters are both much slower than their adventure counterparts too, which makes them less fun to play as, but makes more sense. They shouldn't be Sonic fast, but in the adventure games they were made as such, so correcting that shouldn't necessarily be held against the game. What should be held against it is how bad the combat is with Tails. These bombs stop you dead in your tracks and make you throw a bomb in the slowest fashion possible, but the rest of the time you're playing as him is pretty okay. Knuckles on the other hand is just all around bad to play as. His punches don't work anywhere near as well as they used to, and this much of a speed decrease seems a bit excessive. He is so slow and none of his moves seem to work like they should, but you only play as him 2 or 3 times, and it isn't for very long, which is what I was talking about earlier. They just switch things up for a minute here and there and aren't trying to be standalone gameplay styles. Tails plays a slightly bigger role and even has a full level by himself, but these are a lot more fun. They feel pretty similar to the Adventure 1 Tails stages, but there's too many enemy waves for how bad the combat abilities are. Okay, that's most of what I have to say about the Sonic story. It feels very similar to Adventure 1's, but the alt gameplay styles keep a playthrough interesting the whole way through. Now on to Shadow, who is definitely my least favorite hedgehog to play as. He controls very similarly to Sonic, but his homing attack keeps him above enemies so he can perform a combo and land multiple hits on them. This sucks for platforming. It's so unpredictable and shoots you way too far, and it has a slight delay when hitting enemies, so maneuvering in general is a pain. This homing attack is very handy for taking out enemies with health bars, but that just inclined the developers to include more of them. Enemy waves are way more prominent in Shadow's gameplay, and it's not very fun to fight them at all, but when compared to the vehicle sections in these levels, they seem amazing. Every Shadow level has some sort of vehicle he takes control of, and these control like ass. Walls are glue, and handling is so loose you can hardly control it. The worst thing is that these are mandatory to completing the stages, and they're so unpolished, slow, and boring. I really hate this aspect of Shadow's levels. When he's running around, great. Fighting enemies, okay. Taking control of a vehicle, What makes these levels worse is that their designs are nearly identical to Sonic's, which makes them repetitive, but the fact that they're flooded with more enemies and have these dumb vehicle sections as well makes them pointless to play. The only thing that can redeem this story mode is the alternate gameplay styles, Rouge and E123 Omega, and guess what? They don't. Rouge plays very similarly to Knuckles, except she has bombs as her main attack, just like Tails, and they're just as bad, especially when levels decide to pin you up against a ton of enemies. And her climbing is even more broken than Knuckles. She gets stuck to walls way too much and the camera goes all berserk. Most of her sections aren't designed well either. The first time you play as her, in fact, it has you searching for 3 keys, which makes sense and is faithful to her origins in SA2, but there's no radar to help you. You just wander around and hope for the best. She has a full level too, and this one's actually not bad, mostly because I flew over most of the annoying stuff. E123 Omega plays like garbage. He has the ability to hover, but he's way too slow, and all you do is take out enemies, but gone is the lock-on mechanic from the adventure games. Instead, you hold X and he auto-aims and fires a few bullets, but you have no control over what it shoots at whatsoever. You can face that direction, but who knows if it'll work. This makes taking out enemies so much more tedious, and takes out any fun you could have in these stages. I really like the E102 Gamma levels in the original Sonic Adventure, and the mech levels in SA2 weren't too bad either, especially the Doc Dragman ones, but they really slaughtered this. You hardly have to play as him though, and the sections are short, so it's not too big a deal. I'll be honest though, this is the only one of the 3 story modes I didn't fully complete. I wanted to, but I had enough of these tedious vehicles and Shadow's horrible homing attack and called it quits. And finally, Silver's story, which might be my favorite in the game. Silver's gameplay isn't particularly stellar, but he's the most unique hedgehog to play as. He moves a decent bit slower than Sonic and Shadow, but his psychokinesis abilities open a whole new realm of level design possibilities that I feel the devs hit the mark on. He can float for a short time, interact with these panels on the ground and cause a whole slew of things to happen, lift and throw multiple objects nearby, and stun enemies, which he can then pick up and throw. These abilities are a lot of fun to use, especially against enemies. He can grab missile shot at him and send them right back, which is satisfying for sure, but these abilities are simply impractical for dealing with tons of enemies. He has no physical attacks whatsoever, so your best bet is keeping your distance and slowly wiping them out one at a time. The levels themselves are way slower paced too, which isn't a bad thing at all. They're more exploration and puzzle based, and there's tons to do and explore. The silver medals definitely play a bigger role in Silver's levels too, as they're slower moving and allow the player to take their time and search everywhere. Before we move on from Silver, I have to comment on this 9-ball puzzle thing, which is universally hated, and I agree that it requires way too much precision and patience, but I actually did it in only a few minutes, and it wasn't much of a pain at all. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed these levels, but there are a couple additional gameplay styles in this mode too, the first of which is Blaze's, and these are spectacular. She plays very similar to Sonic, but instead of the standard homing attack, she has a double jump and a homing attack-esque move that sends her spinning at enemies. She also has a ground attack that can take out enemies all around her, which is great for waves of enemies. Her levels are perhaps the best in the game. They're very fast-paced, taking out enemies is fun, and it feels surprisingly polished for a secondary gameplay style. The only downside is that there's only a few levels where she's playable, just like Tails and Rouge, and it makes sense, but in this case I wish they implemented it more. The other playable character this time around is Amy, and good god do these levels reek. It's like the Amy levels in the original Sonic Adventure, but even more slow and dull. She has a double jump that sends her straight up and is way less useful than Blaze's. She can turn herself invisible and sneak up on enemies, which works okay, but I have no clue why she could randomly do this all of a sudden, and she has a standard hammer swing, which is slow and very close range. This might just be the worst gameplay style of them all. It's like someone looked at the Amy levels in the first Sonic Adventure and said, this is bad, but it could be worse. She's playable for the least amount of time though, and that's a good thing. It's like they purposely made the slower and more boring playstyles less implemented, which is great. They wanted the characters to be playable, but knew they weren't all that great and used them minimally. That's a lot of unique gameplay styles. With that many, some are gonna suck. It's inevitable, but the more implemented ones are, for the most part, pretty enjoyable. Knuckles, E123, and Amy are horrible to play as, but you rarely have to, and of the more implemented characters, 4 out of 6 of them are at the very least solid and fun. The two that aren't are Shadow and Rouge, which are in the same story mode, so just avoid playing the Shadow story mode and you're all set. I know they're still there and should lower the quality of the game, but they shouldn't necessarily lower the quality of your experience, as you can just not play that story mode. If you want to beat the game fully, you do have to put up with this, but the last story section isn't all that great from what I've heard, so why would you? The Sonic and Silver story modes are enjoyable to play through and provide an amount of content I'm satisfied with. Most of the quality content in this game can be experienced with just the 2 story modes, and if you're genuinely playing just for the plot, watch an all cutscenes video of the game on YouTube. Before we move on from the gameplay and level designs, I do want to comment on the hub world. I don't see what the problem with it is. I'm not usually a fan of hub worlds, and I sure as hell am not saying I'm a fan of this one, but for what it is, it's pretty decent. There's medals hidden around that make it relatively fun to explore, each section is simple to navigate, and some of the challenges offered by NPCs can be fun. The hub is broken into 3 areas. There's Castletown and New City, which I rather like, and the forest, which is pretty stupid. Mainly because there's this huge open field right in the middle of it, which takes forever to cross, and it's not full of things to do, it's empty. This hub is only used a few times though. New City and Castletown are way more prominent, and I don't mind them. There's not a whole lot to do, nor are there any notable locations within, but it's easy to navigate and the aesthetic of them is nice. And while the residents of the town are bland and look flat out awful, the same can be said about the people in Station Square. These are just far more apparent in HD, and it's only made worse by the fact that you have to interact with some of them. I kinda prefer this hub world to Station Square though. Sure, it's not as memorable, but you only have to navigate one section at a time, which is way more manageable than Station Square's many areas. It's easier to find and get to the next level, and for someone who doesn't care for hub worlds, that's what I prefer. And 06 makes it way easier to replay levels too. You don't have to find the entrance to it every time, you can just select it from the main menu, which is perfect. I don't necessarily think hub worlds need to be in Sonic games, but both Station Square and Soleanna do what they need to and allow you to access the levels you want without being too big a headache to explore. Okay, now's the part of the video where I explain every single event in the plot and why I absolutely despise it. I'm kidding, I'm not going to go over the events of it in detail at all. Instead, I'm just going to share my thoughts on it as a whole and address some of its larger criticisms. As explained previously, the game features 3 story modes, Sonic's, Shadow's, and Silver's, all of which interconnect to tell one grand story and have one congruent final chapter. I don't really like that the plot's split in 3, but it does replicate the feeling of the adventure titles, which I like, and for the sake of telling this game's story, it works well. There's 2 points of criticism that the plot takes a lot of for, and the first of which is that it takes itself way too seriously, and I have to agree there, but so do the adventure titles. At its core, the plot's ripped straight from Adventure 1. Eggman wants to awaken some giant monster with the Chaos Emeralds, and Sonic's gotta stop him. That's a drastic simplification of it, and there's way more to it than that, but the stakes are the same. If Sonic doesn't save the day, the world goes bye-bye. The plot only seems more serious because the villains in the game are genuinely evil, and the situation as a whole feels way more bleak than ever before. The future is established to be a reality where all went wrong and the world was destroyed, which makes it feel like the odds are against them. Then there's the game's main villains, Dr. Eggman and Mephiles, both of which are incredibly menacing. Dr. Eggman's not this silly bad guy that scratches his ass, he's this evil and realistic looking old man. This Eggman design has been beaten to death, but regardless of how stupid it looks, it does contribute to a more serious feeling, there's no denying that. You take that Eggman out and design him to be his normal, cartoony, goofy, expressive self, and the game immediately feels less serious. Mephiles is pure evil though, the game even calls him Mephiles the Dark, and he's a genuinely terrifying nightmare of a character. All of this makes the tone of the game way darker than ever before, but I don't think that's all bad. I found that a relatively nice change of pace considering how lighthearted and non-existent plots are in Sonic games nowadays. It's probably too dark for a Sonic game, and they definitely messed up with some of the time travel stuff, but I found it just as entertaining as the adventure plots. The second main problem with the plot as a whole is the relationship between Sonic and Elise. This is so cringe and hard to watch. As I was playing, I was genuinely on edge, hoping my parents wouldn't walk in and be like, "What the hell are you watching?" This dynamic is so weird, and that's solely because Elise is a human and Sonic is, well, a hedgehog. If you make Elise another anthropomorphic creature, this is fine, or at least way better, but this is just uncomfortable to watch. I don't know why this is here. The whole damsel in distress thing isn't a very good plot device anyways, and it sure as hell doesn't belong in a Sonic game. There's only a few cutscenes that really emphasize this though, and the cool thing is, you can skip them. They aren't too plot heavy and solely exist to build the relationship between the two. Simply pressing the start button when you see these two alone on screen with the old Windows 95 background will solve that problem for you. Sure, they're still there, but they don't have to worsen your playthrough at all. For almost every Sonic game after Colors, especially Lost World, I've had to skip all the cutscenes anyway since the writing is so terrible, but here the writing is actually pretty good for the most part. The only downside is that this is the first Sonic game without Ryan Drummond voicing him, which is a major bummer. He does such a great job and captures the attitude of Sonic perfectly. The new guy they got, Jason Griffith, doesn't do a bad job by any means, he just can't quite match the flair Ryan Drummond brought.
Since Eggman went to the trouble of telling me where Elise is, I think I should thank him personally.
This game of tag is boring. I'm out of here. Finally decided to show up, eh? Okay, bring it on!
Anyways, the Sonic and Elise stuff is painful to watch, but that aside, I think the cutscenes are pretty enjoyable. It's cool to have the whole adventure gang back and playing a prominent role again, and Silver is a great addition to the franchise. The events of the game from his perspective are definitely the most entertaining of the three story modes. It seems like most of the good story elements revolve around him, and it makes sense for the plot to be more serious in tone when his world is decimated. Speaking of his world, this main vocal theme is so good. Like, really, I know almost every Sonic game has a killer vocal theme, but this one is easily top 3 for me. The rest of the game's music is phenomenal. It's definitely the most polished part of the game. Each track fits perfectly with the environment in which it plays and is a standalone solid track. They were designed to fit each moment in the game perfectly, and I can't think of a better example than this opening cutscene. This whole festival thing in the beginning is kind of boring, but as soon as Eggman strikes and Sonic comes on screen, it's just as badass and high energy as that one. Sonic's an expressive little cocky cock, and the rivalry between him and Eggman is shown in its entirety. And the song that plays when Sonic appears is spectacular. It makes it feel way more grand and epic. This is one of my favorite pieces in the whole score and fits the scene perfectly.
Wow, that's a pretty snazzy performance there.
Don't even think about making the whole, the game's whole budget was spent on this remark. That's not a unique or clever insight, so stop. While we're on the topic of the cutscenes, and since I haven't really yet commented on this, the game's visuals are really nice. The cutscenes look especially great, but the game as a whole looks pretty good for 2006. And I think this transition to HD is far better than even the plumbers. Sonic went from this to this, and Mario went from this to this. They definitely tried to go all out in this game, but they just weren't given the time, nor did they have the technology to do it right. Even with that said, the game still got a lot going for it. The biggest thing it lacks is polish and optimization, problems that would both be solved with some sort of re-release. I hear people say Unleashed needs a re-release all the time, which is totally true. That game's not very optimized either, but this game needs it even more. You erase these absurdly long load times and give the devs a chance to fix a few of the game's bugs, and this is a really solid Sonic the Hedgehog title. Now, if they were to remaster it, they'd have a decent amount of changes to make, but not as many as you'd think. Change Eggman to his normal self, make Elise an anthropomorphic creature, maybe fix the huge section in the hub world, code actual snowboarding physics, and make Shadow's vehicles control less like ass. That's really it. Do all those things in a more optimized and polished game, and this is my favorite Sonic game. I've wanted a Sonic Adventure 3 for so long, and always overlooked this game because of how poor it was reviewed to be, but in playing it for myself, I think this was the game I was looking for. It wasn't great, it wasn't even good, but it fits right in with those games and really feels like an evolution for the series. It made a lot of solid improvements, but has a lot of the same problems. The crazy amount of glitches and bugs are what hurt the game the most, and are the only reason I wouldn't call the game good, but I'm comfortable placing it on the lower end of mediocrity. It's nowhere near as bad as it's been made out to be. It's a lot of fun to play. I can definitely see myself replaying the Sonic and Silver stages fairly often, and definitely whenever I revisit the adventure titles. If you've been waiting for a Sonic Adventure 3, stop. This is it. Grab a copy and give it a chance. Set your expectations accordingly, but I don't think you'll be all too disappointed with what the game offers. Especially if you grew up with the adventure titles and have yet to play this. It plays very similarly to those games and has so many callbacks to them that are sure to put a smile on your face, because they did for me. And with that said, thank you so much for watching the video. If you like what you see, leave a like, and if you want to see more, you should definitely consider subscribing. If you want to watch more videos like the one you just finished up, check out my main series Sonic playlist, where there's videos about the first 2 adventure titles and plenty more to come. Thanks again for watching, I'll see you later.